This video will be about leading from the small blind, and especially in scenarios where the big blind overcalls, where we want to lead from the small blind so that the big blind cannot realize equity for free. To give an overview, first I'll talk about small blind leads just in the single raised pot versus the button, and then I talk more generally what functions do leads play and when can we skip them. And then we get to the most important part of the video, namely where do we want to lead from the small blind three-way when the big blind overcalls and why it's mandatory and important. I'll give a summary of boards to lead on, and I'll give some heuristics for which combos to use and then how to play turns when you get called. So let's get into it. There are sort of two different scenarios where scenarios for what the leading range is built around, deep versus shallow. So deep, we need quite strong hands to build the leading range around, and so that's two pair and straights and sets. Whereas more shallow, even top pair can often be enough to get stacks in, and that's why shallow, the leads are built around connecting with our prominent portions of our starting range, and that will be like offsuited broadways and suited hands with a 9 or an 8 in them. And when these hands make top pair at a high frequency, that gives us a leading range, because we even just top pair is good enough to get stacks in. However, I would say that small blind leads in single raise pots aren't particularly important, because most players c-bet a bit too much from the button versus small blind, and also they, even if they c-bet at a normal amount, they're not exploiting us. So the players would only exploit us having no leads if they c-bet at a counterintuitively low frequency, and hardly anyone does that. And if they c-bet too much, then leads are at best unnecessary, and they can even be counterproductive, because our good hands benefit more against too frequent of a c-bet if we just go for check to check raise. But I think it's still worth studying the single raise pot leads, because as we see later, we actually lead on the same boards as we would lead in the single raise pot when the big blind overcalls, and that's where leads become mandatory. And then also maybe in some tougher fields, some players will actually try to exploit the population's no lead tendencies, and then we benefit from playing the lead. To give some background, I think it's quite interesting to go a bit into the theory of why solvers use leads in the first place. So why does out of position sometimes put money in the pot? And I think most people would say it's about the range advantage, and that's why we get to lead. And it's sort of correct, but I think it's kind of correct for misleading reasons. And the truer reason is more about betting volume. So Uri Pelek, a poker coach, has this concept that every hand has a desired sum of chips that it wants to put into the pot. It wants to grow the pot to its desired size. And obviously we will have some good hands, even on boards maybe that wouldn't be favorable to us, and those hands want to grow the pot. And if out of position doesn't put enough money into the pot, then we want to do it ourselves. And so if in position doesn't put enough money in the pot. So the point is that playing out of position, we have to rely, if we check, we have to rely on in position doing the betting for us. And if they will check back most of the time, then we don't like that, and we want to build a leading range. And our top hands benefit from having a leading range even when they check, because often leading ranges are mixed frequencies, and then if we roll a check with our with a set or with a top pair with shallow stacks, we still benefit from the opponent guessing that we will have a leading range, because leading would weaken our range, then they see bet more often, and then whenever we do have a good hand that we checked, we make more chips with it because we'll face a bet more often. And then it's also important to note that leading is more important on dynamic boards than dry boards. So a dynamic board is a board where the nuts change more often, or good hands change more often on turns and rivers. So for example, ace, ace, king is a very non-dynamic board, a very static board, because on most turns and rivers, any ace will still be top trips and quite invulnerable. Whereas a board like 10-8 deuce would be fairly dynamic, because a lot of turns will bring an overcard to the top pair or bring a possible straight. And so leading matters more when we cannot easily make up for missed equity on turns and rivers. So if the opponent checks back on a really static board like ace, ace, king, we can still put in big turn bets or big river bets and still get value that way. Whereas on 10-8 deuce, if the turn is a queen, we've lost visibility, our 10 may no longer be worth that much money, and we wish we would have gotten in a bet earlier on the flop. So now to test this hypothesis that leads are more about betting volume than about the range advantage, I've done a little experiment where I node lock the in position player to have no betting range. So the button will always check. And then we will see if, even on boards where the button has a range advantage, will the out of position player play any leads now if they know that the button cannot bet. And I've chosen button versus big blind here, even though this is a video about the small blind, just because it is about this concept whether leads are about the range advantage or about betting volume, and most players will be more familiar with considerations about who has the range advantage in the often studied spot button versus big blind. So just to go through this quickly, I've chosen 5 boards, and all these boards have in common that the button has a significant range advantage. So the percentages that you see next to the boards are out of position equity, and they're well below 50% on all of them. It starts out with quite static boards, ace, king, and then ace, king, 8, and they become increasingly more dynamic as we go lower. And now the hypothesis that we have for this experiment is that if leading were just about having the range advantage, then even though the button doesn't get to bet, we would expect to see no leads, because none of these boards is where big blind has a range advantage. But then if leading is about preferring a certain betting volume with our range, thanks to, even if we don't have the range advantage, the range has a few high equity hands, and those want a bit of betting, so our range overall wants a certain betting volume to happen. And if the button does 0 betting, then we would expect to see some leads on all these boards still, because on all these boards we have at least some high equity hands. And then the last hypothesis, which is, spoiler, the one that will turn out to be accurate, is that if leading is about preferring a certain betting volume, but that's especially important on dynamic boards, then we'd expect to see leads mostly on the 3 last boards, check 8-2 rainbow, 9-8-2 rainbow, 8-4-2 rainbow, because those are more dynamic boards than the first 2. And then just quickly to show the results, obviously this isn't something you should study because no button will range check boards that are favorable for them. But with this node lock, we see still no leads from the big blind on ace king. Then very low frequency leads come in on ace king 8, but there's no equity loss when we remove them because ace king 8 is still so static of a board that we could just make up for missed value with turn overbets and river overbets. But now on check a2, leads become somewhat frequent. Obviously, all of these boards use large sizings because by leading, we give the button the option to raise again when they were forced to check the range on the flop. So it doesn't make sense to lead for 10% of the pot because that would just be giving the button an option that they previously lacked. But yeah, here we can see leads become a significant part of the strategy, at least frequency-wise, but the EV loss is quite minor. But then as we make the boards even more dynamic, now the EV loss starts to become like slightly significant. If we take away the leading option, then yeah, we lose a bit of EV here. And then on the most dynamic of the boards that we just looked at, the EV loss is definitely significant. So if the board is dynamic, and we have some high equity hands that want to grow the pot, then if our opponent just doesn't do any betting at all, it actually becomes important that we should lead. Just in case anyone is curious, does it matter if, the button bets half as much as they're supposed to bet, and you don't really, even if you think someone doesn't understand that they're supposed to c-bet a lot of hands or sometimes range c-bet, you still don't want to lead on board that are favorable for your opponent unless they just check like way too much. So it's really only in the extreme example. But still, we have now basically confirmed the hypothesis that leading is, for indirect reasons, it's kind of, you can think of it as being about the range advantage, but the more interesting concept is betting volume and our high equity hands in our range wanting to reach a certain betting volume. And then, yeah, in theory, this applies regardless of who has the range advantage. But obviously, in practice, if we play against opponents who are playing like a weird version of reverse poker, we don't want to play leads where the button or in position will put in enough chips for us. But then on boards where we actually do have the range advantage from the small blind, that's where leads come in. And especially so if the boards are dynamic, where our top hands are vulnerable to board changes on turn and rivers and they want to grow the pot, increase their visibility, and yeah, because they couldn't easily make up for missed value if it goes check. And so now that we understand the theory behind leading, we can see why it becomes quite important to have leads three-way on dynamic boards especially. And that's because if the big blind is in there, there's another player that can draw out on us, and equity denial matters twice as much. And maybe you could say that it even matters more than twice as much because the big blind has a weaker range when they overcall, and they're also in the sandwich, so they have to overfold because the button with the uncapped range is still behind them. And so the lead just accomplishes really a lot because the big blind has more auto folds. And so basically, if we miss the lead, we transfer equity from ourselves to the big blind. And here we can see an example of this. So I chose a situation 40 blinds deep, and the situation is button raises, small blind calls, big blind overcalls. And here we are looking at small blind first to act, and we do not want to check our range here, start with a procedural check, and instead, this is the sort of spot where you definitely want to take time and consider leading. And as we can see, even second pair leads more often than it checks. And it's quite important because if we put in the small bet, B30 for instance, although it doesn't matter super much what sizing you pick, this is the big blind's reaction, and we see all this clearance here. In the bottom left corner, you can see all these offsuited hands with an overcard to the top pair, ace 3-0 to ace 7-0, king 3-0 to king 7-0, queen 4-0 to queen 7-0. Those all have to fold. And then there are also some hands with two overcards to the 8, so king 9 offsuit, king 10 offsuit. And you get all this clearance with just a small bet. And then we can go into another example where we need even more protection with our top pair, where it's even more striking how important the leading range is for our equity. So here's this 10-8-2 board, and again we're in the small blind. Here I chose 30 deep instead of 40 deep, so we don't have any pocket pairs. But yeah, as you can see, even our second pair is basically a pure lead. Like, it wouldn't be a mistake to just lead this pure here. And then, yeah, again, if we play this lead, we get all this clearance here, even hands with two overcards to the second pair. King 9 has to fold, or even king check offsuit mixes some folds. And something that's quite funny here that I noticed is that if I remove the small bet to lead, but I accidentally keep in the all-in lead, then the solver actually rather plays a few all-ins than to just check range here. And that's how important the leading range is. So the solver really, really wants to get money in, and desperately so that it rather does like a 4x pot overbet at not 18% frequency than just check this one pure. So let's give it back the lead and then see how much it hurts basically to take it out equity wise. Obviously this is maybe one of the boards where it matters the most, and if the board is like slightly less dynamic, like jack 8-2 or then like queen 9 something, the equity loss is smaller, but it's still quite significant, and you want leads on all these boards basically. And on this one it's highest, and it's absolutely massive, as we will see shortly. I'm trying to find the equities right now. So here it is. We see our EV is 3.04 at the moment with this leading strategy, and the big blind has 1.14. And so now let me take out both the all-in and the small lead. So from 3.04 for us and 1.14 for the big blind, it goes to 2.76 for us and 1.38 for the big blind. So the big blind gained 0.34 in equity, and we lost ever so slightly less than that. So maybe the button gained like 0.02 or something, and the big blind just gained almost all our equity that we lost. The big blind says thank you because we gave it to them basically. I'm trying to find my keynote again. There it is. So yeah, that's the takeaway. Missing leads three-way from the small blind, transfers equity from us to the big blind. We don't want that, so let's study these leading strategies. How do you implement the leads? It's actually quite easy. You get to lead on the same boards that you would just lead heads up in the single raise pot. There's one very specific exception, and that's just like boards like 6-4-3 or 6-5-4, whatever, where the big blind does really quite well. And that's why we don't want to lead on these, but that's maybe just like 3 or 4 boards. And frequency wise, you can use similar frequencies, and especially shallow, the frequencies, if anything, they can go higher sometimes, because of the fact that your leading range at shallow stacks is built around vulnerable top pair, whereas at deeper stacks you lead more around really knotted hands like 2-pair sets and straights. And so since those knotted hands deep stacked are less vulnerable, you actually lose less equity to the big blind when you range check. And yeah, that's why especially shallow stacked, the frequencies can go really high, and there are situations where you want to lead like 75% of your range easily. Whereas deeper stacked, it's less important, but you still want to play leads, especially on a board where you have some knotted hands, but also some top pair that benefits from protection. For instance, like Queen 4-2, where you have sets with pocket 2s and pocket 4s, and then also a bunch of Queen X that just benefits from folding out some of the big blind's weaker overcards. There it also makes sense to play leads at 100 big blinds deep, for instance. But yeah, mostly focus on more shallow stacked situations. And as we can see here on the bottom of the slide, yeah, having leads matters, especially on dynamic boards, but even some ace high boards are quite dynamic because of the straight draws that they have. And we have some leads on like ace queen jack because our king 10 offsuit, which we have a lot, makes a straight. And then even on that sort of board, it actually makes sense to play leads three-way because it's still dynamic enough. But then if we're 100 deep, we can skip leads on some boards that are more static. And also like in the single raise pot at 100 deep, we would have some leads against just the button on ace 2 or king 3 because we have a bit of a set advantage, and then also just our range is more condensed than theirs, and we have a bunch of pocket pairs that maybe benefit from a little bit of protection. But those considerations matter less three-way because pocket 4s or pocket 5s are just not worth much three-way, because there's a higher chance that we're already beat. It'll be harder to realize equity, and so we can just completely skip leads on these boards, I would say, three-way. But yeah, the good news is that we can basically just study the single raise pot situation, even if we don't want to play leads in the single raise pot, to know where to go for a high frequency lead multi-way. And now to do that, let's get into it. So again, deep stacked leads are around 2-pair plus, and shallow stacked it's around top pair. We're starting with the shallow stack situation, and this is the small blind range. And as you can see here, we have 8-9 offsuit or ace offsuit pure or almost pure. This is a range that I simplified for my own studying. Probably the solver mixes like very low frequency raises with those hands, but I just simplify to calling those pure, and then also we have pocket pairs make up a big portion of our range, and so we can have set advantages with our condensed range on boards with 2 or 3 low cards. So with this range in mind, it makes sense that we would play leads on specifically ace 9-8. I know it's quite specific and maybe not worth studying, but if you know, you know. And then boards where we flop straights with our offsuited broadways, that we call it a high frequency. For some reason, I've seen that especially the boards where king 10 and queen jack make a straight are high frequency lead boards, whereas boards where, for instance, king queen makes a straight are led at a lower frequency. I don't know exactly why that is. I just think it could have to do with like the frequency that the button makes 2 pair or the button makes a straight themselves, and thus maybe we 3-bet king queen at a higher frequency than we call it or something like that. But in any case, that's something you can just memorize. And then the most prominent board where leading is interesting is boards with 2 low cards and 1 high card, or then just obviously like 3 low cards. We have a lot of leads because of all the set advantage. There's like a small exception if you have a board that is king 5 and another low card, because the button opens king 5 almost pure, king 5 offsuit, then making this like offsuit top 2 pair is already somewhat significant because it's so much about not advantage, and that's why we wouldn't really want to lead much on king 5. But then if the board is king 4-2 or king 4-3 or king 3-2, that's the sort of board where we can play leads. And then we can play leads also versus the cutoff on these types of boards. Also on king 5-4, because the cutoff is not opening king 5 offsuit anymore. And then the last board category is paired boards, 9-9 or higher, with 1 low card. And on those boards, it's also a bit about the condensedness of the range. So since we're calling, we just need a stronger range than the opening range. And pair boards are specifically dry because there's 1 less card that makes pairs. And then if the board is really dry, it matters more how strong is the initial range that you get to the flop with. And so because the small blind range is more condensed than the button range, we sort of automatically have a small range advantage. And then if you add 1 low card where we can make the nuts quite a lot with the set that we make with the low card, that's enough to build like a leading range around it. And then also obviously 9-9 plus, we have trips a lot with our offsuited combos, and that also drives like this strategy here. So those are all the boards where it makes sense to lead deep stacked. On sizings and frequency of the lead, you can just default to B25 and that should be great. The frequencies are actually not massive, and that's also part of the reason why you can skip this leading strategy if the big blind does not come along. So the frequency is really only 15 to 25% on most of the boards that I've shown. It goes up to 50% on specifically Queen Queen and the wheel card and 10-10 and the wheel card. Yeah. And on the sizing, I would just use B25 all the time. And then if you lead in a spot where you have no hands that benefit from protection, then you can size up, since you're leading around really strong hands around an odd advantage. And so on like ace 9-8 specifically, or a flop like 6-3-2 where you actually don't have a lot of 3x or 2x or even 6x that wants to lead, it makes sense to bet larger and already start putting a lot of money in the pot, because you're basically saying with the lead that you might have a set or you might have two pair, and that's why you start leading. And also on the ace 9 8 you have like jack 10, queen 10, queen jack offsuit for straight draws, and those hands can also start betting somewhat big to clean their outs, like against like king 10 or so. And now we will go to the other range when we are, I think this is 30 deep, but it's quite similar for 20 deep or 40 deep. Obviously 40 deep we call some of the time with our pairs, but otherwise the ranges are extremely similar. And the important part here is just this region here. Queen jack offsuit calls roughly half the time, and then king 10, queen 10, jack 10 call more often than they raise. And then we have this suited 9x and 8x region quite frequently, and a bit of 7x here as well. And we have king x quite a lot because our suited kings like calling so much here. And that already tells us on which boards we make top pair a lot, and that will be what our leading range is built around. So here's some rules I put together that cover essentially everything about leading small blind versus button 20 to 40 deep. So it's mostly that, I think it's mostly about 30 deep that I looked into, but it should be similar for 20 deep and 40 deep. So the rule is if the flop doesn't contain an ace and it has two cards in the 8 through king region, and even paired flops where this applies, so any pair from 8 through king, those are boards where we have a frequent leading range, and then anything 10 high is worth leading, because as we saw in the ranges, jack 10, queen 10, and king 10 are high frequency flat calls, and offsuited hands make up a bigger portion of our range than suited hands or pairs, because they have more combos that are offsuited. So yeah, even just any 10 high flop is good enough that we want to lead at a high frequency. 8-7 high also makes it in there, because we call with hands like jack 7 suited as well. And then just like at 100 deep, flops where king 10 or queen jack make straights, even though they have an ace, those are also good enough for us to find leads. And then sizing, again, beat 25 works fine. We can just go with that, or beat 30, whatever you prefer. The frequencies are a bit higher, so that's worth noting. So if we do want to play leads on these boards, it can go easily up to 50%. So you would play maybe like 25 to 50% leads on the boards that I was talking about, and even 75% leads on really the best ones. And those are like 10-8-8, 10-10-8, and 10-8-7. And then a small note on sizing. Just like in the deeper stacked example, if you ever find yourself in a spot where you have a leading range and you realize that you have very few hands that benefit from a small bet for protection, then you can size up. And so one example here is 10-2-2 flop when you're 20 deep. So 20 deep compared to 30 deep, we have rejammed most of our ace-x, and ace-x would maybe benefit from a small bet for protection, but if we no longer have it, and we certainly don't have any pocket pairs, then our leading range is really just built around top pair and bluffs, essentially. And maybe some traps, like we may have trapped kings or something pre-flop. Then we obviously just benefit from getting maximum protection and value with our 10, and we can bet 50% of the pot, maybe already shove some turns. to turn our top pair into a 2-street value hand and stuff like that. So, but in most cases, if you 30 deep, you can just lead only for b25 on this sort of board, and it's perfect. And then combo selection for the hands to lead with. So this is actually quite important, and if you have never played leading strategies in this spot, you're at risk of making mistakes, because when you learn a new concept, you wanna show what you've learned, and then you might choose the wrong combo and it's actually a blunder, so be careful. So it's important that you often just, even though most of the hands in your range mix, when you look at the solver, it's actually quite suit specific. And if you just see like, oh, ace 10 offsuit leads there a bunch, but then if you choose the combo that doesn't have the backdoor flush draw, then it's just a blunder. So yeah, just be careful and be quite suit sensitive with your choices for bluffs. You basically never want to lead hands that have the wrong suits and they have no good overcards, or they have nothing going for them. Don't lead them. The one exception is maybe if you have like a 75% lead spot, it probably wouldn't be wrong to just simplify to leading range anyway. So maybe there you can get away with it. But if you know that your global frequency is 50% or lower, and especially if it's only like 15%, you have to be really, really selective. And at the very least, you want like an overcard to the top pair that has some good clearance property, where when you bet b25, you actually fold out hands that dominate you, you clean your outs, you have favorable suits, stuff like that. And obviously, especially if you go for a big sizing, like leading 100 deep on ace 9-8, then you just want real equity, and you almost don't lead hands that are worse than having a gut shot. Like maybe you could lead like queen 7 suited, backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw for b50, but that's like the only sort of hand that comes to mind, and otherwise you just want real direct equity, or like a pair or two pair basically. And I think, I don't even know if 9x or 8x are particularly interested in leading there, because they don't accomplish much protection wise. So I think it's mostly ace x and two pair that you want to lead on that sort of board. And then also think about the clearance of your hand. So for instance, if the board is check 8-4 rainbow 30 deep, small blind versus button, you have ace 9 offsuit, which I think I would mostly jam that pre-flop, but it probably mixes some calls as well. And then if you think about it, you don't accomplish very good clearance with your hand, because you will get called by better ace x. You might fold out ace 7. And you're sort of in the middle of a range, and it's not the sort of hand that you want to lead. It might make more sense to lead something like queen 6 suited to get folds from like queen 7, or especially if you have like queen 5 suited, although I don't know if that calls preflop. But anyway, think about your clearance is the point here. And you don't want to lead hands that play quite well in the check line or check call a small bet. And yeah. And then last point. So I was talking a lot about how you want to avoid blunders by leading combos that have nothing going for them. And that's a good heuristic in the single race pot. But then multi-way, you can also make the opposite mistake, and it can be a blunder to not lead certain hands. And so with the bluffs, it's less important, because it's basically never a blunder to not turn something into a bluff when the leading range is never 100% lead. But just be aware that three-way, if anything, default to doing it too often with your vulnerable value hands, because on the best sort of boards for you, it can be a blunder to check a hand at all if it's good and vulnerable. And then lastly, we can look a bit into turn play after leading, because that's obviously an important part of the strategy. And if you mess that up, you might end up hurting yourself. So since you lead also a bunch of speculative, drawing hands or hands that go for clearance, that have an overcard to the top pair, you have a bunch of weak hands in your turn arrival range, and you kind of just keep betting with everything. So you also want to check some value hands on the turn to protect your checking range. You can totally simplify your turn strategy to just use one sizing, and then if you only use one sizing, you want to prioritize the big sizing to get the money in with your value. So the solver also has sometimes, the solver will split and have block bet and big bet on turns, but you can skip the block bet without losing much value at all, or basically nothing. So yeah, to simplify, I would just go for big sizing or check on the turn and make sure to put some good hands in your checking range. Although don't put like vulnerable top pair in there when you shallow stacked. So instead put like second pair in there, and then you will have to bluff catch with it occasionally, and it might be uncomfortable, but that's just how you play the spot. And it wouldn't be any easier to play if you start with a check and then face aggression from the button. You will run into the same issues. And so worth keeping in mind that the most typical lines after you lead the flop, the stuff that happens the most frequently, are what we could call the top value line, where you lead for a small size and then you start to polarize and you bet big on the turn. And then on the river, you either have quite a give up hand or you bet big again. So that's one thing that happens quite frequently. And then the other thing that happens quite frequently is what we could call the protection line, where you lead flop and then you check the turn, and then if it goes check check on the turn, it makes a bit more sense to block bet the river rather than go lead flop check check turn and then bump the river for a big size. Sure, you have some check to check raise on the turn, so you have some good value that you could bet big on the river, but most of your turn checking range is either bluffs or speculative hands that didn't improve or didn't turn more equity, or it is vulnerable hands that were not strong enough to go bet bet bet. And that range is best represented in a block bet, so B10 or B50 depending on the specifics of the situation. And so you just have to be careful that that's where most of the equity of your range is concentrated in, and you can't just bluff big every time just because in position has kept themselves by checking back the turn. Yeah. And then lastly, a general out of position heuristic is that you want to avoid situations where you have to check call awkwardly with draws that have no showdown value on the turn. So it makes sense to think ahead when you reach the turn after leading with a draw, whether your draw is good enough to bet again or maybe to check shove. And sure, if the draw is has a bit of showdown value and it has like an added straight draw perhaps, maybe it is okay to check call, but just think about that in advance and don't end up in an awkward situation where your draw is a bit too weak to go check all in, and you don't really want to fold it, but you're kind of forced to fold it because you realize you have no showdown value, and if you miss the river, you will just lose even against the bluffs, and then it's like pretty awkward to play it that way, and you should have just continued betting. I think that's the last point in the presentation, and I will just briefly go through some examples of playing turns. This is the first situation here where I chose a single raised pot situation. We call in the small blind, big blind folds here, just for illustration, to make it easy. This is our leading range on the flop, and it's concentrated mostly. We get to lead, let's put it like that. We get to lead because we have a set advantage here. And this enables us to carry the rest of our range, including like vulnerable top pair that benefits from leading, even hands like pocket fives that benefit from protection, getting protection. So we start with a bet, and then the button caps themselves a little bit, at least frequency wise, but they still call some. So as we see here, kings is not a pure raise, which is interesting. So, and they have to protect their calling range here because our strategy will actually be a lot of overbetting on turns. And if someone always raises kings, then the overbets will go even better for you, and you might be able to start overbetting more thinly than the solver does. Like maybe then ace king, ace queen, or even king queen could become worth an overbet on the turn. But let's see how this goes. Button just calls. Turn is, let's say, 8. And then we see here that GTO Wizard, which solves for all kinds of sizings, uses just this quite complicated sizing mix, but this is 2x pot, and then this is 3x pot, and those are used at a fairly high frequency. And then obviously we check 60% of the time, which is similar to a spot where, button C bets range, and then they have to check a lot on the turn because they also C bet weak hands. Because once you get called, the caller has some strong hands. And also, we're out of position. We don't want to grow the pot too much. We have to do a lot of checking. But the important part here is big sizes are used really quite a lot. And I try to simplify this with the AI version of GTO Wizard where you can give custom sizing things. And I gave it I gave it 2x pot and B30, the small blind. And we can see here that it's roughly an even split. And if you want to get rid of one of them, I would get rid of the block bet. But you can also try to implement the range split. And even though you have this block bet, you actually just mostly check with a hand like queen check offsuit to protect your checking range after leading. And then the block bet is used with really vulnerable hands, and then with a bit of queen X, and then occasionally you throw in a trap. But mostly your sets go in the big bet line, or infrequently in the check raise line. And here we see ace queen is still worth 2x pot overbet some of the time, and this will go even better if button caps themselves by raising aggressively against the lead, as many players will probably do because they won't expect you to play 2x pot on turns. And now to finish, I'll go into the shallow stacked situation because this one plays quite differently, and you obviously don't need the overbet because the SPR is already shallow. So I decided to just go with a check 9-5 randomly to have some diversity. That's also a leading board, as we see here. In fact, it's 50% lead for the small blind, and I think, yeah, this is even a three-way spot, and that's probably why we lead so much, because we want to shut out the big blind. So we start leading here, and even second pair leads at quite a high frequency here. Then the big blind, as we can see, has to fold a lot of hands that had overcards against our pair, if we have a pair. And then the button now is much more interested in fast playing queens and kings, obviously, because the SPR is so shallow. But if the button just calls, let's look at some turns. First, I chose a king because it's maybe a bit of an interesting turn, because we actually do lead king X a bunch because we have so much of it. Especially the ones with a straight draw here. But also some like king 7 leads that have like some clearance going for them maybe. So on the turn king, we can now just bet our king outright, and we don't want to really check them for protection, because we can protect our range just good enough with check X and 9X. We don't need to risk facing a turn check and then not getting paid if the river is like an ace or a scary stray card. So this shallow stacked, it's important to avoid a mistake where we put like a vulnerable hand into the checking line that can just go for value, and instead we want to protect our checking range, but we can protect it with more like a hand like check 10. So that's an important concept on the king turn. And then if the turn is like a blank, it's quite interesting to see that we get to continue betting quite a lot. And sure, if I gave the solver 2 sizings, maybe it would use like the small sizing a bit, but I think I've actually done this and it didn't want to use it very much. So I can briefly show this. Let's give it B25 as a block bet. And yeah, it's used it only 8% of the time, so we can definitely completely skip that. And we just use a sizing that looks probably 2E-ish, polar sizing, and ace 9 still good enough to, it probably doesn't want to shove rivers, but it can go into this bet and then protect our river checking range, I assume. And then obviously top pair mostly wants to keep betting, but very occasionally we can use it to check jam to protect our turn checking range. And then it probably makes sense to use like, queen check specifically requires less protection than like check 10. So we see here that check 10 bets at a higher frequency than queen check. So and then let's say we check here, button will be quite aggressive. They will use a similar polar sizing built around mostly their check X, and even 9X can go for value. And then we have some check jams with our turn slow plays, and we have to go into bluff catching with a hand like 9-8, or and then just decide on rivers, sometimes call, sometimes fold. important to see how we play our draws on the turn. That's the point I made earlier about forward planning. So if we are here on the turn with a flush draw or queen 10 straight draw, we have to think ahead and sort of avoid getting into an awkward check call line. If you look at the flush draws, I mean, it's quite varied and specific, but basically, for instance, I think this 10-7 suited, it has basically no showdown value. So my guess is that it'll go for a pure check jam. Whereas the like king 8 wants to bet pure, and then I don't know what king 7 will do against a bet. Let's just look at this. Button bets. Yeah, the king 7 is check jamming. The 10-7 is check jamming. And queen 8 suited is the one that is maybe just good enough to sometimes check call. Maybe what also factors in here is that maybe your opponent will bluff a lot if the turn is a 10. I don't know. We never have king queen, they have it a lot. But yes, so just when you have a draw, think about, can your draw check call? If not, you wanna either check jam or bet outright. There's of course also the concern that if we bet out, what happens if the opponent jams on us? We mostly, here we can call king 9 suited. King 8 suited has to fold, and that's probably why it sometimes went for a check jam. Yeah. And then last point, it's totally fine to just range check if the turn is bad for your range. Like button obviously calls a lot with their ace high hands. And then we see after leading the flop, getting called by button, and turn being an ace, it's so good for the button that we check 95% of the time. You can easily simplify this to range checking. Let me see if maybe if we bet smaller, we could have like a protection range built around check X. Is that worth it? Interestingly enough, it looks like the answer is yes. So like one thing you can maybe do here is that if the turn is really bad for you, you can still think about the value of getting some protection and then just have like a block bet mostly built around former top pair and second pair, and then just button is supposed to raise you quite aggressively, I would assume. Maybe because the SPR is so low now, they either have to jam, or I mean, it could be an issue with the solve. I'd be a bit skeptical of some of these results because of, it depends what sizings we make available. If button has the option to use small raises, they will use that a lot and they will put our block bet in a tough spot. And now we already want to block bet less often than in the previous solve. But the block bet still stays in, so I think it's like a valid strategy to use it a little bit. But yeah, I think probably range checking would also be fine. Just make sure you don't have big bets when the turn is very bad for you. So yeah, let me find my presentation again. To summarize the whole video, the key takeaway is that when you play three-way small blind versus big blind versus button, small blind leads become mandatory, especially shallow stacked. And then if you miss the leads, you're transferring equity to the big blind, and you don't want to do that. And to study these important leads, you can just study the single raise pot, which you see on GTO Wizard, for instance, where to play leads, and you can play leads on the same boards when the big blind tags along. And then in the single raise pots, you can actually ignore these leads unless you think your opponent is exploiting a population tendency and is checking back really, really counterintuitively frequently on those boards where you have the range advantage in the small blind. And then lastly, on combo selection, don't lead hands that have nothing going for them. For bluffs, you should make sure that you have the right suits, or you have overcards with good clearance when you bet. And then on playing turns, note that it's okay to check a lot after the initial lead, because that's sort of how the spot works, and that means you also have to occasionally check strong hands. And then that's a general out of position concept. You have to think ahead with your bluffs that lack showdown value, because it's awkward to check call not your bluffs with your draws that have showdown value. It's awkward to check call with a draw without showdown value on the turn, and then on the river they check back with the bluff and you still lose. That's probably a misplay then, and you should have thought ahead and either bet yourself or gone for the check raise. So yeah, that's it. Good luck at the tables, and find those leads when the big blind is in the pot.